George Hoyt Allen. I named this talk "No Bad Ideas" because George Hoyt Allen, during his lifetime, had more ideas than you could shake a stick at, and he was not afraid of trying out all of these ideas. Some of them worked out, some of them did not, but we're going to learn a lot about Mr. Allen's ideas. Here we go. What did I say? Technology is not my forte. We're going to look at three different phases of George's life. We're going to have a little introduction that talks about his life before he came to Clinton, before he became Cedarine Allen. Then we're going to talk most of the time about the Cedarine years. And then we're going to talk about his life after he sold the Cedarine factory and the kinds of things he did during that period of time. This is a map of Clinton in 1874, before George came to Clinton, but I just used it as a background here to show you where he spent most of his business and personal life in Clinton. His homes, he had several homes. His homes and his businesses were all located in the space between the old canal and Oriskany Creek. This is George Cedarine Allen, George Hoyt Allen. He was born in Cleveland in December of 1857. And when I first decided to do this program on Cedarine Allen, and people asked me, what are you doing your program on? And I said, oh, George Hoyt Allen. And they would either look at me with a blank stare and say, what? Or they would ask me, as I asked John a number of times, is he related to the hardware Allens? He must be related to the hardware Allens. And after John told me for about the fourth time, it finally sunk into my head that no, he was not related to the hardware Allens. George, as I said, was from Cleveland, Ohio, and he had a fairly typical story for the mid-19th century. He came from a large family. He had 5 brothers and sisters. His father passed away by the time he was 11. By the time he was 13, he was working on a farm. By the time he was 19, he was working in a factory. He had very little formal education, maybe 4 years, maybe 5 at the most. You would think that he probably did not have very many prospects. You would think he would probably end up in that factory for the rest of his life. But you would be very wrong about George Hoyt Allen. By the time he was 50, he would be a prosperous businessman living in the village of Clinton, making a furniture polish, Cedarine furniture polish, that was known nationwide and also was sold in several countries overseas, Great Britain being the main one, but it was sold in other countries overseas. He was a world traveler, as John mentioned. He had traveled around the world at least 3 times, maybe 4. He also traveled extensively in Europe and all over the United States. He was an author, had written numerous books. He was a community leader here in Clinton. And he also, in some instances, had some national influence, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. When George was young, he traveled quite a bit, or he moved quite a bit. As I said, he was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1857. By the time he was 3, his family had moved to Coldwater Branch, Michigan. I think they probably moved there because his father went there to get work. His father was a house painter. His father died sometime when they were living there. George was about 11. And his wife, George's mother, moved the family to Brookland, Ohio, when George was about 11, right after his father passed away. I'm not sure if they had family there. Couldn't determine why they moved there, but they did move to Brooklyn. And there, George worked on a farm. and they stayed there until George was around 17 or 18 years old, and then they moved to Hughesville, Pennsylvania. Hughesville, Pennsylvania is in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, and in the mid-1800s, it was a center of furniture manufacturing. Williamsport, Pennsylvania, particularly, was a hub of furniture manufacturing. Furniture manufacturing was moving from the East Coast westward. And so I believe that Mrs. Allen moved her family, 5 sons and a daughter, to that area so her sons could go to work in the furniture factories. And that's where George got his first taste of the furniture world. And he worked first as a sander in one of the furniture factories, and he found out that he could make more money if he became a grainer, do the fake graining on furniture that was very popular during that period of time. So he worked for about a year in a factory doing sanding, and then teaching himself how to do graining on the side, bought the tools to do graining. And he moved up to Jamestown, New York, after about a year or so in Hughesville by himself. He didn't move with his family at that point. And he worked in a furniture factory up in Jamestown doing graining. He worked there for a year, and then he decided to move back to Hughesville. And he worked for another factory in Williamsport, excuse me, doing graining. He worked there for about 3 years doing that graining, learning more about how to manufacture furniture, making more contacts. After 3 years of that, he decided he didn't want to work in manufacturing anymore. He wanted to go into sales. He had a gift of gab, so he went to work for the same company that he had worked for first in Williamsport as a salesman. And he worked for that company from 1881 to 1884. And his territory was all the way from New England over to St. Louis, Missouri. And sometime between 1881 and 1884, he traveled to upstate New York, through Clinton, through Syracuse, and sometime during that period of time, he met Mary Scoville. The Scovilles were living in Marcellus at that time. Shortly after they met, after George and Mary met, the Scovilles moved to Clinton. Dwight Scoville was a Presbyterian minister. I had thought he was a minister at the Stone Church, but Midge Bacos set me straight. He was never a minister at the Stone Church. Come to find out, he was a minister at the Presbyterian Church in Franklin Springs. No, not Franklin Springs, in Kirkland. Yes, John's back there shaking his head. Get your facts right. He was the minister in Kirkland. I do believe, however, by the time he moved to Clinton, he probably was retired. I think he was probably the minister in Kirkland, maybe when they were living even in Marcellus. There's some period of time in there, I can't quite pin them down. Anyway, I skipped a slide. Let's go back here. Let's see what George thought about his early years, how he saw it. These are sort of amusing, so I'm going to just backtrack just a tiny bit. Later on in his life, George put together a booklet writing about how he thought about his early life. And I thought it was worth taking a look at these drawings to see what he thought about those early years of his life. The first drawing is when they lived in Coldwater Branch, Michigan, and he was only 8 years old, and he got a job. And that job was in a shingle factory. And his job was to take the shingles and sawdust out from underneath the buzzsaw where the man was cutting the shingles. So that was his job, and that was his interpretation of that job. The next picture is when he was living in Brooklyn, Ohio, and he was working on the farm, and he told a story of milking the cows, and there was one cow that if you didn't strap her back legs together, she would kick him up to the rafters, and that's his interpretation of being kicked up to the rafters. by the cow who he named Brindle. And this last drawing was when he was working in the first factory in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and he wanted to learn to be a grainer, and he had borrowed the graining tools of one of the grainers there. The grainer found him out, and he kicked him down the stairs, and George said he felt like he was back in Brooklyn, milking Brindle. So that's a picture of him being kicked down the stairs. So now I'm back on track, and we're back in Clinton in 1884. Just a couple photos of Clinton in 1884, and this was the year, excuse me, this was the year that George came to Clinton. This was the year he married Mary Scoville, and he, although he was somewhat of a traveling person after he moved to Clinton, and he certainly moved a lot when he was young, he never had another home after he came here in 1884. He came to Clinton, he married Mary, and from that point on, he called Clinton his home, and he never was afraid to tell people how much he loved his adopted hometown. So from 1884 to 1917, these are the Cedarine years. This is the years that he developed the Cedarine furniture polish, the years he sold it, the years he marketed it, and the years he made his money producing it. And during those years, there were many different aspects of George's personality. He was a multifaceted man. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of these facets of George's life and personality. He was a salesman, an author and lecturer, a gadfly, and by that I mean he was not afraid to speak truth to power. When he saw issues that he felt needed to be addressed, he addressed them, and often in his own unique way. He was obviously an entrepreneur. He started this business of the Cedarine furniture polish from virtually nothing and made it a worldwide business. He was a world traveler, and he was a mentor of young men here in Clinton. But before he gets really involved in the Cedarine furniture polish, he still has to make some money. He's got to get some money from somewhere. So he still is a salesman. He works for Stickley Furniture from 1884 to 1889. And this got me confused for a few minutes in my research that John says I did nothing but talk to him about for 2 months. To me, Stickley Furniture is Gustav Stickley, upstate New York. Well, this Stickley Furniture company is in Grand Rapids, and there were, I think, a total of 5 or 6 Stickley brothers, and they all originally were from upstate New York, but 2 of the Stickley brothers, John George, and I think it's Albert, though I got the names confused in my head right now, 2 of them moved to Grand Rapids and started their own furniture company out there. And that's the furniture company that George went to work for in 1884. I believe it was probably because he made some connections in his when he was working for the Williamsport Furniture Company. He probably met people, and that's how he got that job. And in that company, he traveled the entire eastern seaboard of the United States selling this Stickley furniture. And he worked there from 1884, as I said, to 1889. And it was during that time, during the 1884 to 1889, that the Cedarine Furniture Polish Company was started. And something that I found out that I hadn't told John, because I didn't see him, I found this out near the very end of my research, believe it or not, was that the Cedarine Furniture Polish Company was not started originally in George's name. It was started in his brother Dan's name. and that was in 1887. However, George, I believe, based upon what I read, was the main instigator of the company, but that probably he didn't put it in his name when he first started it because he was still working for Stickley Brothers, and that I'm assuming that he felt that Stickley, if they had found out about it, would not be too happy that he was operating another business while he was still their salesman. So it was started in Dan's name, and it remained in Dan's name until 1889, when George quit his job with Stickley. And the other thing that I found out was that Dan was chemist. So it is likely that the two minds, George, who knew a lot about furniture, he knew from making it, from selling it, and all of his contacts in the business, he knew furniture. And Dan, who was a chemist, knew the chemical properties of various things. So the two of them together figured out what should go into cedarine furniture, or cedarine furniture polish. So that's how the company first started. But I was literally 2 months of research on this project, and it wasn't until the last week that I found this tiny, tiny little article in a newspaper that referenced the fact that the company was first under Dan Allen's name in 1887. No place else was it mentioned. This picture, and John will attest to this also, this picture in this house drove me nuts for a while. But it's not the house, it's not the picture, it's the number of this house. This house in 1884 was 96 College Street. Today, this house is 104 and a half College Street. It is what I call the Sycamore House because I love the tree that's out in front of it. It's the house that's right next to Oriskany Creek. In 1884, it was the house that the Scovilles lived in. And I believe that after George and Mary were first married, they lived with them for a while in this house. And I also believe that based upon what I can determine, that it is likely that the first batches of cedarine furniture polish were manufactured in some of the outbuildings of this house on College Street. But the reason it drove me bats is because, and I don't remember when the house numbers changed, but at some point in the history of Clinton, the house numbers changed, and what was 96 College Street in 1884 is something, there is another 96 College Street in 2019, and nobody told me that. And I was trying to figure out why it just didn't make sense where they lived and the other things that were said, and it got very confusing. But this was the Scoville's house. This is where I believe the cedarine furniture polish business started. In 1887, while the cedarine furniture polish business was still in Dan's name, it was trademarked. The name was trademarked. It was trademarked in the United States in that year. Some sources say that it was trademarked in Great Britain in 1889. Others say it wasn't until 1899. I haven't been able to track down which that was, but in 1887 it was on its way. Cedarine furniture polish was on its way. That's the only bottle that I have been able to find, the kind of bottle. I think it was the bottle that was designed in the beginning, and that was the only one that was ever used. I've got to get my water, excuse me. George, as I said, took over the business in 1889. Dan stayed with the business for at least another 15 years. He had moved out here from Cleveland, and he stayed with the business. Excuse me. But it was George's from 1889 on, and you could tell that George was at the helm. There was no question about it. Dan primarily did sales work from that point on, from the time that George took over. And one of the things that George believed very, very deeply was that the way you could sell things the best was to give something away with it. In the mid to late 1800s, sales premiums were just starting. The idea of giving something away with your purchase, whether it be something in a box of oatmeal or that kind of thing, that was just starting. It was a unique idea at that period of time. And by gosh, George thought it was the best idea since sliced bread, as they say. And one of the things that's puzzling is how he decided what he thought was the best thing to give away. It would have been fun to be inside of his brain sometimes, because I don't understand, because most of the things had almost no relationship to furniture polish. The first thing that I could find that he gave away as a sales premium was a knife sharpener. And that's what this schematic is for. He had a patent for this. He wanted to give away a handheld knife sharpener that was sort of like a big pencil, and then on the end of it, it had a bunch of I think it was sort of oval, and it had like an piece of emery board, not emery board, I don't know, tell me, like on a sander, like emery cloth, and sandpaper, sandpaper. Senior moment here. And he wanted to have the name Cedarine Furniture Polish all printed around the thing, like today on pencils. But back then, no machinery had been invented yet that you could print around on a round piece of wood. And he went around and tried to find somebody that could do it. And a couple people said, oh, for $10,000, $20,000, or $1,000, maybe I could come up with a machine that would do it, blah, blah, blah. And he didn't want to spend that kind of money, so he designed and patented a piece of equipment that would print on this round piece of wood and then put the sandpaper-like thing on the end. And he built a wood shop here in Clinton, and he had these made. And in 1891, he went across the United States with these knife sharpeners in one hand and a suitcase full of Cedarine furniture polish in the other, and he came back with more orders for Cedarine furniture polish than he knew what to do with. So I guess even though it had nothing to do with furniture polish, other than maybe you cut up your vegetables on a table that you put the furniture polish on, I don't know, but he had a good idea there. And this is probably the first sales premium that I could find out that he used. And he not only designed it, but he built the woodworking shop to make it. And he had several other patents according to some information that I could find, but I couldn't track them down. It's hard to track down old patents, to do a search on old patents. He made a lot of money off from those knife sharpeners, and so in 1891 he decided it was time to spend some of that money. So he did two things. He bought a house and he bought a new factory. The house he bought was on College Street. It was right across from where today's Cleveland Place is, though it was set back quite a bit from the road, and there was enough property for a farm in back of it. And in 1926, when Woodlawn Place was made, that house would have been right in the middle of Woodlawn Place. So it was moved, and part of it was taken apart. Part of it, I read that a barn, it was made to build a barn, but I'm not sure where the barn was. But the rest of it, this part on the right-hand side, is still there. It's 2 Woodlawn Place now, but there's another house in front of it because it sits so far back from the road. So that house is still there. That is one of the houses that George Hoyt Allen lived in. No, he didn't have his factory in the library building. This library building in 1884 was one of the fraternity houses for Hamilton College, but his factory was just to the east of that library building. It was in a building that was an old roller skating rink. There used to be a roller skating rink in Clinton, and it was not being used for that, and he bought it and used it for his factory. Unfortunately, shortly after he bought it, there was a pot of paraffin, I guess they might have used it to seal the bottles or something, and it tipped over, there was a fire, and it burnt down. George was quite badly burnt. He was, I guess, incapacitated for a month or so by his burns.
So the building next to it was on College Street? The building
next to the library? Yes, facing College Street. Yes, yep, it was. Yep. But he apparently had enough resources that he had another piece of property on Dwight Avenue, and within 2 or 3 months he was up and operating again. The company was up and operating, making furniture polish again on Dwight Avenue. He didn't let adversity get him down. He just kept on keeping on. This is one of the first ads that I could find that mentioned Cedarine Furniture Polish. Really isn't an ad for Cedarine Furniture Polish, but it suggests that you use Cedarine Furniture Polish. I'm only showing you this because it doesn't say anything, basically, to give you a contrast when we look at later ads. In the beginning, things were a little low-key. Later on, George's ads were anything but low-key. So it was 1892. It was in Dansville, New York. That's out in the western part of the state, I believe, somewhere. So, you know, he was being mentioned in ads, but they weren't ads that George had his finger in. What we have up here now is the first example of a printed sales premium that I could find. What this is a booklet, and I have up here on the table. I'll talk about what's up here a little later too, but is a booklet called "The Story of the House That Jack Built," and it is a old British nursery rhyme. And what George did was he had these reproduced, and he would give them to businesses that bought his furniture polish. He would have them personalized with the business's name and address. And I think the promotion that's on this one says that it's for like $20 worth of product. You would get 300 of these personalized with all of your name and address and all that kind of information. It is a sweet nursery rhyme. The illustrations on this pamphlet were done by a woman named Margaret Landers Randolph. She also did illustrations for Clinton Scholar. And I also found here in our collection a little booklet. If you ever have time to stop in and look at it, it is adorable. It is called The Talking Trees of Clinton, and it has pictures of many of the large trees. This was probably in 80 something that it was done, of many of the large trees that were in the village at that time. One of them is the sycamore tree. So it's a sweet, that's a sweet thing too, but it really is a wonderful little handout, and it is the first printed sales premium that I could find. This next slide is of another kind of sales incentive that George used, and this one I found to be pretty unique. You have to remember that the time that we're talking about now, it was the school town era in Clinton. Education was very important in this village at that time, as it is now. But there were a number of private institutions. School education was at the forefront. And this booklet, which we don't have all of it in our collection, we only have part of it, but what it is something that young men and young women apparently would take with them, and it sounds like it's a door-to-door sales, would take with them when they went out to sell cedarine furniture polish. And it says, as you can, I think everybody can read it, but I'll just read it in case there are some that are sitting way in the back. The party who succeeds in selling in this time the most cedarine will, if a man, be educated at Hamilton College, and if a lady at Houghton Seminary, both institutions located in Clinton, New York. Now, we don't have any real details because part of the brochure is missing, so I can't find out what time period it was and whether this was just in the village or whether it was in some other geographic area. But I found this to be just fascinating that that this was a way that he used to sell his furniture polish. But it is not unique in terms of him using sales promotions or advertising. That is a combination of he wants to sell his product, but he also is doing something that is philanthropic, say that twice, that he is doing something that is good for the community or the country. He combines those two thoughts quite often in his lifetime. So, but that one sort of blew me away, And the thing that also I found intriguing is that if this indeed was door-to-door sales, which is what it implies, there are young women doing door-to-door sales in the late 1800s. I mean, it's sort of a mystery. And I could not find any kind of reference to it in any newspapers. I spent many hours on old newspaper sites doing research, but I could not find any reference to that. So, the mid and late 1890s were good for George Hoyt Allen. His business was doing well. He had a son. He was becoming the community leader here in Clinton. There were notices, stories in the newspaper about him being active in the community. He had started a farm. I mentioned that there was room behind that house for a farm. He had started a farm. And he decided he wanted to expand. He loved the furniture industry. He loved building furniture. So he decided he wanted to buy a furniture factory. And he looked quite a while before he found one. And he found one in Hastings, Michigan. He looked in New York, but he didn't find one that fit his criteria. So he found one in Hastings, Michigan in 1897. He bought the factory. It's hard to tell whether he closed cedarine temporarily or whether it was just sort of on pause or whether it was just running slowly. But he did not move. He didn't leave Clinton. He just sort of lived between the two towns. He had the factory for about a year. It was doing very well. He had 180 employees out there, many orders for his furniture. And then tragedy struck, and there was a fire, and it burned down. Even though the furniture factory was doing well, it was mortgaged. His house was mortgaged to raise money for the factory. So he was up the creek without a paddle when that factory burned down. What was he to do? What he did was, once again, he picked himself up, he dusted himself off, and he came back to Clinton, and he decided this was it. No more anything else. I'm here in Clinton. I'm going to make cedarine furniture polish. This is my home. That's it. So what he did was he borrowed $1,000 from one of his brothers who was out west. What was he out west? Oh, he was a gold digger looking for gold, a gold miner. And he had a printer that he knew in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who would print something for him on credit. And George wrote this book called Good Morning, Nice Morning. And what this book was about was George's tale of woe. How his life had been good, everything was fine, he bought this furniture factory, and then lo and behold, the hammer struck him down, but he just got up and he came to Clinton and he was glad to be alive, and he was glad that he knew how to make cedarine furniture polish, and the world was a good, wonderful place to be in. And what he did was he sent out 7,000 copies of this book to every contact that he had in the furniture business. Anybody that might possibly buy cedarine furniture polish. And all of the contacts, all of the work, all of the sales that he had done over the previous years stood him in good stead. And the orders came pouring in. And from this time on, from 1898 was when this book was sent out. I want you to see who it was written by. It was written by Cedarine Allen. It was not George Hoyt Allen. It was Cedarine Allen. From this point on, he was Cedarine Allen. There had been a little bit of that before, but mostly he was George Hoyt Allen. But after the Hastings debacle, though it wasn't really his fault that it was a debacle, but after that it was Cedarine Allen. He was all in on cedarine furniture polish. And part of what shows what I mean is this was a letterhead in an envelope that was sent out in that same year soliciting business. Oops, wrong thing. His picture is on the envelope, is on the letterhead. It's the same image as in the book with the bowler hat. That became sort of iconic too. And the company, prior to 1898, the company was Cedarine Furniture Polish. I think that's what they call themselves. After 1898, it was Cedarine Allen Manufacturing, or Cedarine Allen Company. There was nothing, it was just his name. So he talk about making a brand, making your brand. It was Cedarine Allen. Before the furniture factory, he used premiums somewhat. We talked a little bit about some of the premiums that he used. After the furniture factory, after the rebranding to Cedarine Allen, he needed more money. He needed more sales. So he went all in with every kind of sales premium you possibly could think of. Most of them that I could find were things that if you buy cedarine furniture polish, I would give you this. The only one that I could find that was, if you buy this, I will give you cedarine furniture polish, was this pen and ink stand. And we do have one of these up on the table. On the bottom of it, it says, if you buy this, we will give you some free cedarine furniture polish. On this, it says that this is patent applied for, but I don't know if it ever was actually patented. And I believe that this probably was made in his woodworking shop here in Clinton when he had the woodworking shop. In a newspaper article in 1911, Cedarine Allen talked about some of the many kinds of sales premiums that he used, most of which I could not find referenced anyplace else. So I put it on the slide, and I will read it for those of you that can't see it. It says, but framed pictures and slapjacks and picture puzzles and flying machines and waste paper baskets and faith strengtheners and Burbank Indians and stop your kicking cards and tape measures and Roosevelt spelling books and postcards and grandfather clocks won't last forever, you know. Something new and novel wanted. Storekeepers are particular about what you give them to induce them to buy furniture polish. Now, I don't know what half of those things are, but I'm taking him at his word that he did use all of those things as sales premiums. I don't know what a stop your kicking card is. I don't know what a faith strengthener is. But if any of you have any of those things in your attic, we would love to see one. We could at least take a picture. It may be precious to you, and you don't want to donate it, but I would love to see it. We do have on the table up here that you can look at after the program some of his sales premiums, a couple of his books, some other items that you can take a look at. This slide has another couple of the sales premiums that he used. He was very taken with Native American images, with Asian images. Very often they were in sets, so that it would encourage you to go back and buy more, so you could get another, the other image in the set. This is one of the iconic Cedarine Allen images. This is Lillian Boyd Lewis and with the pig Blanche. She was, as I think many of you know, she was the wife of the longtime Mayor Harlan Lewis. She has written on the back of this particular image, and it is up here on the table, so you can read that. I won't read it to you. It just tells you about when her take of having the picture taken. It is a sweet, sweet image. We have one that's in a frame here too, and also we are lucky enough to have in our collection the glass negative that the picture was taken from, and I have that on a light board up here so you can see the glass negative. But it is, I love that. Here are a couple of the later advertisements that I talked about, so you can see the difference in the ads. The first ad that we had just had a little sort of footnote, use Cedarine furniture polish. This one in the middle, the Cedarine furniture, introducing Cedarine furniture polish. On there are 3 different sales premiums, 2 different pictures, and then one that's a picture with a mirror. The one on the right says hot stuff for souvenirs. Cedarine had gone to Europe shortly after Vesuvius had erupted and got a whole load of lava stones from Vesuvius and was giving away lava from Vesuvius as a sales premium. The one on the left, it's hard to read, but this is him on his farm, and he grew buckwheat. And he had it made into flour, and he was giving away buckwheat flour as a sales premium. both in wholesale sizes to stores, so they would buy his furniture polish, but then also in smaller bags to the customers, so that they would be enticed to buy bottles of cedarine. So, I mean, there was nothing that he would not use as a sales premium. And as I said, most of it was not related to furniture polish. It was just whatever idea popped into his brain, he would use it as a premium. One of the other things that I mentioned earlier that he did was he was a world traveler. There was a little blurb in the Courier in 1899 that says, "It is interesting to note that Mr. Allen required but 64.5 days to circumnavigate the world, while Jules Verne's hero required 80. I think it also is worth noting that there were 23 years difference between when Jules Verne's hero circumnavigated the world and when George did. So, maybe 23 years. It could have gotten a little bit faster in going around the world. But Cedarine Allen was a prolific traveler. This was a front page article in the Syracuse Post-Standard in July of 1918. It was the entire front page. It wasn't just above the fold. It was the entire front page. And during a relatively short period of time, between 1899 and 1915, he went around the world 4 times. That is documented. He made at least 3 additional trips just to the Far East. He made 2 trips to Europe that are documented, and he traveled to all of the United States at that time. And don't ask me how many states they were. I was going to look that up. It was written to travel to all the United States. And this morning I was thinking, boy, you ought to see how many states there were then. But somebody here knows how many states there were between 1899 and 1915, but not me.
48.
Were there 48 then?
They added 2, I think. They added Arizona. No.
I just wasn't sure, if there were 48 at that, when the last of the 48 became.
Well, Arizona, New Mexico.
They became, by 1915, they were 48? Yeah, okay. Anyway, he traveled all over the place. Other than one of the trips to Europe that he took with his wife, and I'm sure he probably did some business on that trip too, but that was purportedly a pleasure trip. All of the others he said were in connection with business in some form or another. Either to try to open up different markets for cedarine furniture polish, or he also started a import business. He also purchased things to use as sales premiums. Many of his sales premiums were copies, but some of his sales premiums were original prints from Asia or other parts of the world. He also sometimes traveled on behalf of other businesses, or writing syndicated columns for newspapers. One of his trips, his first trip around the world in 1899, he acted as a representative for Maddox Furniture out of Pennsylvania, no, not Pennsylvania, Jamestown, New York. And even today, if you search Maddox Furniture, his name will pop up in relationship to it, even though it was just one trip. In 1910, one of his trips, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, was on behalf of a magazine, La Follette's magazine. So he had many, many reasons for his trips. most of them, the primary reason was to do with his own business, but they were usually subsidized in some other way other than his own business. The results of his trips were often a book. He produced 5 travel books out of his trips, and we're going to talk about those a little bit. And he also, from his trips, he had a personal collection of Asian collectibles and antiquities. So we're going to look at those in a minute too. You often see, this is just an aside, you often see pictures of him in his garden or on his farm. In his writings, he said he did not want to be a farmer when he wrote about his youth. He couldn't wait to get off the farm, but he created a farm here. He had a farm here, and you often see him in his farm. So I think maybe he protests a little bit too much sometimes. As I said, he did write. He loved to write. This is a list of all of the things. If I went on something called WorldCat, the World Catalog that you can find online, and all of these things are listed as things that he had published or he wrote. 7 are actual books that were published. Others are brochures, pamphlets of various types. But he wrote 6 travel books, 5 to do with his world travels, 1 to do with a trip to Florida. He wrote a book on mulch. That one is actually in the Kirkland Library. I didn't go down and get it out, but he did write a book in 1931 on mulch. There's a number of brochures that have to do with his talking truth to power type of things that we'll talk a little bit about some of them. But he was a prolific writer. The only thing I think he liked to do more than write was to talk. But he did love to write. This is just 3 of the books that he wrote. The one in the middle is from his first around the world trip, a commercial pilgrim. The one on the right is his last trip around the world, a Yankee in the Far East. That one has a number of illustrations by an illustrator named H.S. Weller. Harriet Sanders Weller, I believe was her middle name. She was from Waterville. She was the wife of a prominent lawyer, but she always identified herself as H.S. Weller because she could get more jobs illustrating if her gender was not identified. I have an example of 3 of her illustrations, and the book is here also, so you can see more of that. The book on the left is Uncle George's Letters to the Garcia Club, and we're going to talk about the Garcia Club a little bit in a second. These are just a few ads, and there's one review of the book. He often used his books as premiums, sales premiums, and whenever there was an ad for one of his books, he always put reviews in with the ad so you could see how great the book was. He never hid his light under a bushel, ever. You always knew about George. The one review that I put in here, and you would have to read his books yourself to see if this is true. This gentleman says his descriptions remind one of Mark Twain's writing. That may be a little a little flowery. I think he tried to write in the style of Mark Twain. You'll have to judge whether he made it. I did not read all of his books. I read little excerpts of some. There was only one negative review that I found. I'm sure there must be more out there, but the eyes only can last for so long. But there was one negative review, and it was in a Chicago newspaper, and I'll read that because it sort of offsets this. It says, the author takes the attitude of Americans met traveling who persist in looking on foreign parts and foreign people from the point of view of their hometown and laugh at them for being different. And I didn't, in what I've read, and again, I didn't read a lot, but I did read excerpts from several of the books. I didn't see that. I didn't see Shakespeare either. I didn't see Mark Twain, but I didn't see him laughing at other people. I saw some language that today we would not call politically correct, certainly, but I didn't see him laughing at people, but everybody sees things differently. As I said, probably the only thing he liked to do more than write was to read or to talk. He was on the lecture circuit from probably the mid 1910s until the late 1920s. He lectured a lot, mostly in the New York, the South, and the Midwest, though there were some references as far as out in California here and there. He lectured about his travels, mostly. There was no indication that he used it as opportunities to sell his books, but I'm sure he talked about them, but they didn't seem to be sales. I think it was just that he liked to talk. And I'm sure he got paid for his lectures, but he didn't use them as sales opportunities. He liked to talk about his travels. As I said earlier, George was also a mentor to young people, young boys, and he also was an active member of his church. The Garcia Club, which was a boys' club that he started in 1900, was an offshoot or an outcoming of a dozen years that he spent as the Sunday school teacher, a boys' Sunday school teacher at the Stone Church. And the Garcia Club was in existence for about 5 years. They were a oratory, literary, community service organization. Had a great impact on the boys. Even though the club was only in existence for about 5 years, they had regular reunions for a number of years afterwards, and it was well known for a number of years, even after it went out of existence. People talked about it in the village. Elihu Root, how did he pop up? In 1913, the Board of Trade, the Chamber of Commerce of that day, wanted to do something for the boys in the town so they would not get in trouble over the summer. So George provided the plots of land, seeds, and all that stuff. And the boys planted their garden. At the end of the summer, it was judged who did the best. George and the mayor announced the winners, and Elihu Root gave out the awards. Elihu Root, who was the sitting senator, former Secretary of War and Secretary of State, and who had been the Nobel Peace Laureate the year before, was giving out garden prizes to the little boys of Clinton. The Courier wrote that no doubt if the president had been available that day, George would have gotten him to give out the awards. Okay, I think we're getting a bit long, aren't we? Are we getting a bit long? No? Yes? No? I can... John, are we getting long? No. Okay. Somebody else famous is popping up. Robert Taft. I know nothing about politics in the early 1900s, but apparently tariffs were in the news then too, and George didn't like Taft's position on tariffs. So George wrote an open letter to Taft. Taft never responded, but a number of senators did. And one of the senators that George got in touch with in response to that was a gentleman named Robert La Follette, progressive senator from Wisconsin. And out of that came an offer for George to write a series of articles for La Follette's magazine. He was paid $5,000 to do that, and out of that came another book, so he got $5,000 and whatever the proceeds were from his book also. So George did pretty well out of that one. One of the things that George was very adamant about was that this country needed parcel post. His business selling his cedarene furniture polish was so successful that he had to ship this cedarene all over the country and all over the world in some cases, and it all had to go by private carriers. And George felt that the Postal Service should have parcel post, so he could send his packages through parcel post. So in 1911, he undertook a campaign where he mailed out 100,000 letters with an attached card where the recipient of the letter could send a little card to their congressman or senator encouraging them to support pending legislation to create parcel post in the U.S. Postal Service. That was not particularly popular for some reason with a number of businesses. I don't know the politics of it, but many people were not happy with it, and George got a lot of negative feedback, and his business suffered quite severely during that period of time. But he stuck with it, and he kept sending it out. And in 1913, parcel post became a part of the United States Postal Service. Whether George had any real influence, it's hard to tell, but his campaign is a footnote in a couple of articles that I found and came across when I was doing the research on this. So at least he's remembered, whether he did any influence, but he was remembered. Here we are. I love that picture of the women. Anyway, in 1913, there apparently was a move in the town of Kirkland to possibly have a local option vote so that the town of Kirkland could become a dry town. There's some indication that the town of Westmoreland might have been a dry town at that point. I could not confirm that, but one article alluded to that. And George apparently was a teetotaler, and he supported the possibility of Kirkland becoming a dry town. So he started his own little newspaper called the Booze Cart, and it was supposed to be a daily paper. I can't find much evidence about how long it began. We have about how long it ran. We have about 5 copies of the Booze Cart here in our collection. Sort of interesting to read. It started in October of 1913. The last copy we have is in November, so maybe it lasted longer. If you have some of those in your attic too, the Booze Cart, so we can see how much longer it was published. I could not find any indication in the newspaper that the Courier even acknowledged that it existed. But it was sort of an interesting sideline of George. He always put his money where his mouth was, no matter whether it cost him how much or whether it made him friends or not. In 1915, George filed a lawsuit against Chanel Chemical Company of Chicago, Illinois. They produced a furniture polish called Cedar. He said this was a trademark infringement. He spent about 1.5 years preparing for that lawsuit. In 1917, the lawsuit went to court. It was in federal court in Norwich. Apparently, it was something to behold, especially when George was actually there himself. the Courier called it a comic opera when George was there. Opera bouffe, I guess is how you pronounce that. The Chanel folks said there wasn't any cedar in Cedarine. Apparently there wasn't at that point. I don't know if there ever was. I assume that at some point when it was first made there must have been cedar in it. Maybe the formula got changed. I don't know. But I guess that didn't matter because George won his lawsuit. They said that it was a trademark infringement. George won the lawsuit. Almost as soon as the lawsuit was settled, George sold Cedarine lock, stock, and barrel to the Chanel Corporation for a tidy sum, the newspaper said. Just a real quick aside about that I found a connection between Cedarine and another company that started in Clinton. Very tenuous, but I thought it was interesting. In 1917, George Hoyt Allen sold Cedarine to Chanel Chemical Company. In 1962, Chanel Chemical Company was sold to Drackett Chemical. In 1965, Drackett was sold to Bristol Myers. So the remnants of Cedarine was sold to Bristol Myers. So the two companies that started here were joined together. Okay, just a few things to tell you about George's years after Cedarine. And I was talking to my son about the presentation, and he said it looks as if what his life after Cedarine was not important. You know, there's only. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that his life after Cedarine was unimportant. I think that he continued to be active in the community. He continued to take up causes. I think that he was important in other ways. I think this is the part of his life that really has gotten forgotten. And I think that it merits more attention than probably I'm able to give it. The lawsuit was settled and it also shows more about how he combines his own interests with that of the community and the country. The lawsuit was settled in March of 1917. We entered World War I in April of 1917. By October of 1917, George Hoyt Allen was selling something called hulled corn. Does anybody know what hulled corn is? Hulled corn is hominy, or dried and ground up, it's grits. And in the beginning of World War I, the government wanted us to ration wheat. They wanted the wheat flour to be used for the war effort. So if by October of 1917, after he had sold the Cedarine Company in March, he had already been thinking about this before he sold the company. Because this stuff, he had to be growing corn. He had to be talking to, I assume, Clinton Canning Company for them to process the hulled corn. There's a process to get the hulls off the corn, so you just get the nubbin in the middle to make the hominy. So he already had to be thinking about this, knowing, or at least thinking about what was going to happen in terms of how the country probably was going to be going into World War I, and this is what was going to be happening. It didn't just happen overnight. So George was planning. He was thinking about what was going to happen. So he developed this product, Aunt Martha's hulled corn. And he sold it And again, I'm assuming it was produced at the Canning Company. Was the Canning Company in business in 1917? Yeah? Dick is saying yes, you're saying you don't know. My two resources here. I had forgotten. Anyway, Aunt Martha's hulled corn. It was sold primarily, or at least exclusively, in the central New York area. The only ads I could find are Utica, Rome, Syracuse, in that area, in Clinton, of course. It was sold both in cans, and then I saw some that was dried. The thing that I found in this, if anybody has a picture of this, I will pay good money for this. Personally, I will pay good money for this. There is this was in the Clinton, I don't know if it was in the Advertiser or the Observer, or the Courier. There was an automobile, a covered automobile delivery van, bearing on its side the letters of gold, the magic name of Aunt Martha's hulled corn. So there was a van, a truck or something that was running around town with Aunt Martha's hulled corn on the side. And the driver was Bob, C-A-K-E-T-T. Does anybody know Hackett?
Bob Hackett, sure.
Sure?
Yeah.
You have that picture?
His wife taught me first grade.
Oh. Anyway, so this was his very first project after Cedarine, and the ad on the right is what I mean about George. He put his money where his mouth was. He was selling hulled corn. He had his name on the ad, but what this was almost a full-page ad for Liberty bonds, not for hulled corn. It was so you get out there and you buy those Liberty bonds. This is something that you should do for your country. And then at the bottom it says, "This is paid for by Aunt Martha's hulled corn." So he wanted to make money. He wasn't throwing his money away, but he was supporting his country and community. The next thing that I can find that he did, and this one I don't think George was thinking straight when he did this one. This was for another furniture polish. And this one, he called it Romba, R-O-M-B-A-W. And he registered this name almost immediately after he sold Cedarine. But he didn't do anything with it, excuse me, until after World War I. And then after World War I, he started manufacturing it. And he had the ads all the ads I saw were sort of like this. They were real sort of strange looking ads. He called it the big idea. He had a contest to have people tell him why it was the big idea. He put money up. He put up $5 for the first place prize, and that would be $75 in today's money. So he was willing to put some money up, but it just didn't seem to go anywhere. I only found ads for 1919, 1920. I think this was, maybe he thought there were no bad ideas, but I think this one probably was a bad idea. I think he probably just didn't want to get out of the furniture polish business, but I think he should have. But again, we're back to this was another almost, I think it was a half-page ad in 1919. This was called Victory Liberty Loans. It was the name that the Liberty bonds were called after the war. This was the last of the Liberty bonds to pay off World War I debt. And he again paid for this full-page ad. Again, he's got his Romba over here, but he is again spending his money to try to support the country. Oh my gosh, here's 96 College Street again. For those of you that I haven't put to sleep already, you'll remember that I talked about 96 College Street before. This is the current 96 College Street. It's on the corner of Cleveland Place and College Street. This is the way it looked in 1925 when it belonged to George Hoyt Allen. This is the way it looks today. This 96 College Street played an even larger role in George's life than the other one. This was his home. It had part of his factory at one time. This little add-on here was also a vault where some of his collection of Asian collectibles and Burmese Buddhas was held. So it was a fairly important place for him. In 1923, after he had moved out of that house, he opened it up and called it Clinton Restroom. Yeah, right, that made me laugh too. The term was unfamiliar to me, though apparently it was used during that time period to sort of describe a roadside attraction, a place where people could just stop and literally rest. And he opened it up, and he had his collection of Buddhas that he had gotten in his trips to the Far East. It was a place where it says that people could read and write, and I don't know. It still has me puzzled. I could not really find out exactly what this was, but it got a lot of publicity. It got publicity really all over not really the country, but almost. And one thing that caught my eye was that there was a magazine at that time called The Furniture World. It was a trade magazine for the furniture trade, and they sent somebody to cover this, and they gave it a 3-page layout in The Furniture World. And this was 6 or 7 years after George had stopped making furniture polish. So it just showed to me, what kind of influence he had in the furniture trade, even after he had been out of it for quite some time. So I was impressed by that. This had nothing to do with furniture. There were Buddhas in there, but it wasn't furniture. So that was really quite impressive. But I tried to do research on whether there were other restrooms around at that time. There was some indication that there were restrooms for females in big department stores or something that were not necessarily bathrooms, just like with a fainting pouch or something. But it was interesting though. 2 years after it started, it had to have been closed because he was having an auction of all his Asian collectibles at 96 College Street. I don't think anybody realized how big his collection was until they actually had the auction. There were 275 individual pieces of various kinds of Asian collectibles, most of them antique, most very valuable. And this was just one of 3 auctions he had. He had 2 here in Clinton and 1 in New York City. I think this was undertaken because his wife was very ill at that time, and I think he was just trying to get his life together and downsize. That's just a picture of some of the items. The very last public crusade he undertook was during the water wars, the Clinton water wars of 1934. I first heard about the Clinton water wars from John Burdick. In 1934, Clinton was trying to determine whether they were going to continue to get their water from Miller Brook or whether they were going to get their water from White Creek. And apparently it became quite a heated proposition. And there were many meetings, there were many letters to the editor. I'm not sure what other kinds of shenanigans went on, but from things I read in the paper, there may have been some fisticuffs even during all of this. There were pins and there were buttons and there were all sorts of things going on. George Hoyt Allen took one side and he did it in his own inimitable way. He was a White Creeker, and he did go to all those meetings, and he did write lots of letters to the editor. I've seen many of them. But what he did was that he created Aunt Drew's tonic. He bottled it, and he sold it around town for 50 cents a bottle. And the contents of Aunt Drew's tonic was White Creek water, and it would cure what ails you. And he truly did this. It was bottled, it was labeled, and it was being sold for 50 cents a bottle. And one of the quotes on the label, or in a letter, it was a letter that he had in one of his ads. It says, "Your tonic, Aunt Drew, is wonderful. My wife has started taking it, and now she doesn't kick at my cigar stubs and ashes." I don't know if the cigar stub was in his mouth when she kicked at it, but she doesn't do it anymore, so you better go out and buy yourself some Aunt Drew's tonic. What I also found amusing was the letter that he wrote to the editor. Apparently, Miller Brook won, because the letter that he wrote to the editor says, "Dear editor, I understand we got licked. The good Lord let the children of Israel go after chastening them 40 years in the desert. I had hoped that 50 years of Miller Brook water would be enough chastening for Clinton, but it seems we need still further punishment. How he must love Clinton. George Hoyt Allen." So I guess Miller Brook won. Believe it or not, I barely touched on the things there are to know about George Hoyt Allen. There are all these other things that we could have talked about. Unfortunately, we would have either had to have an intermission or you'd had to brought your toothbrush. I think I've really gone on long enough. If anybody does want to know about any of those other things that are up there, you can talk to me later on, or I can refer you to a lot of places for research. But he did grow pecan trees, he bred rabbits, he did all those other things. A pomologist is somebody who grows fruit trees, and I had to look that one up. I did struggle with how to end this presentation because there's so many different aspects of George Hoyt Allen. He was a multifaceted man, and I have grown to really love him. But I decided to end with two different sides of him. The quirky guy on the left who would have his picture taken in his top coat and his bowler hat with Blanche the pig, and the sweet man on the right who wrote this letter to his wife about coming home to the town he loves so much, and I will read that. "My dear wife, I've been in Naples, dreaming Naples for a week, and now what I want to see is New York, bustling, wide awake, get up and dust New York. My only reason for wanting to see New York is that I can get to Clinton from there in so short a time. I sail tomorrow and will land in New York the 14th, in time to catch the evening train for Clinton. I'll get home at midnight, leave the front door unlocked, the light on in the hall, and a lunch on the dining table. I will come in quietly and not wake the family. I hope that you've learned to like George Hoyt Allen a little bit as much as I have. Thank you so much.